Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Good afternoon and maybe good early morning to anyone who may be listening from Korea or in Asia. So it's lunchtime here at Stanford. I'm skipping my lunch for this talk. So hopefully you can enjoy this conversation. So I'm Gi-Shin, Director of the Schoenstein Asia Pacific Center here at Stanford. Also, I lead Korea program. So on behalf of the center and also Center for Strategic and International Studies, I'd like to welcome all of you to this book launch event for our volume, The North Korean Conundrum, Balancing Human Rights and Nuclear Security. So this book is a collection of papers that were first presented virtually in June of last year at our center. It was a 12th annual grad workshop. So the papers in this volume represent the work of international experts, scholars, and practitioners. They explore the political issues that intersect with how we address the North Korean human rights problem. Okay, these range from inter-Korean relations to international cooperation, law of United Nations, and denuclearization to information flows into North Korea. So as you know, these topics continue to be important, perhaps more important now in light of North Korea's response to COVID-19, as the DPRK has tightened restrictions on its borders, resulting in reduced trade and worsening the economic and social situation of its population. So we hope today's presentation and discussion will provide a taste of some of the topics covered in this book, which will be available fairly soon. Okay, now I'll introduce speakers lineup for today's event, which includes my co-editor for the book, Ambassador Bob King, and two authors for our volume, Ned Gretchen and Victor Cha. So as you know, Bob King served as the U.S. Special Envoy for North Korean human rights issues at the State Department from 2009 to 2018. Actually, so far, he was the only Special Envoy for this position, and I hope that we can fill in the next one fairly soon. So he's now Senior Advisor to Korea Chair at CSIS, and Senior Fellow at the Korea Economic Institute, and board members of Committee for Human Rights in North Korea. So Bob was actually a 2019-2020 Korea Fellow at our center for the fall quarter at Stanford. Ned Gretchen is Vice President for Programs at the Open Technology Fund, a congressionally funded NGO that supports the development and deployment of anti-censorship, privacy, and security technologies for populations living under repressive information censorship regimes. The last but not least, Victor Cha is a Senior Vice President and Korea Chair at CSIS and Vice Dean for Faculty and Graduate Affairs and Professor of Government at Georgetown University. So he served as a Director for Asian Affairs at NSC from 2004 to 2007, and was also the Deputy Head of Delegation for United States at the Six-Party Talks in Beijing. And Victor was also 2019-2020 Korea Fellow for the Center, for the winter quarter at our center at Stanford. And we really appreciate your help and support to co-sponsor this book launch event today. Okay, so today each of our panelists will be speaking for about 10 minutes. And then I'll lead some conversation among us and then take some questions from the audience. So if you have any question, please submit your questions through Ask button on the event page. Okay, once again, thanks for joining us, and hopefully you'll enjoy conversation on this very important topic. So without further ado, let me turn to Bob, Ambassador King.
Thanks very much, Victor. Thank you for the fellowship, the correct fellow appointment, which allowed me to spend some time working on North Korean human rights issues when I wasn't tied up with the day-to-day mechanics of doing it when I was the special envoy. And thanks also to Victor for co-hosting this event to talk about the North Korea Conundrum, which will be out within the next week or so. Nat has been a good help and support in terms of dealing with North Korean issues for a long time. And it's great to have this group of people to talk about some of the issues that are raised in this the book that's being published. The book was an outgrowth of a conference held that focused on North Korea human rights issues and related issues. And the idea behind this was to look at the question of the relationship between security issues and human rights issues. This conundrum that we talk about in the title is this interaction between security and human rights. And is there a trade-off? If we focus on human rights, does that make it more difficult for us to deal with the security issues? If we focus on security issues, do we have to ignore human rights? The argument that we'd like to make is that, in fact, as Victor phrases it in his essay, this is not a zero-sum game. It isn't, if you make progress on human rights, you have to give up on security, or if you make progress on security, you have to give up on human rights. The argument is that the two are interrelated and that we can come up with better solutions if we can work on both issues at the same time, if we can walk and chew gum at the same time. One of the things that's very clear is that North Korea's record on human rights is one of the worst. It's a rogue nation because of its nuclear weapons and missile programs, but at the same time, it has one of the worst records in the world in terms of its record on human rights. Periodic reports that rate countries on their human rights record consistently put North Korea at the bottom or close to the bottom. Reports come out periodically. There was a recent report, study that was done by the World Health Organization, International Labor Organization, looking at the consequences of workplace accidents and injury. And the conclusion was not only was North Korea one of the worst country in the world in terms of its loss of life and loss of and harm, but that its record is getting worse, not better. And so the idea is to look at this question of can we work on these issues and find ways that human rights and nuclear security can make progress together. One of the things that we are not doing, and we consciously tried to avoid that, we're not trying to catalog the human rights abuses of North Korea. This is something that's done by a number of NGOs, non-government organizations that periodically report and give details of what's going on in North Korea. The best example, the best study of this issue of North Korea's human rights record was a commission of inquiry that was established by the UN Human Rights Council, headed by Justice Michael Kirby. The report, which was published in 2014, is one of the best and most detailed discussions of North Korea's human rights record. We were fortunate to have Michael Kirby participate in the conference, and he has written one of the chapters in the book which talks about the problems of North Korea's human rights record, but also on the kind of progress that can be made pressing North Korea on human rights in other areas as well through the United Nations. One of the participants in the conference and one of the authors of a chapter in the book is Ambassador Jun Oh, the South Korean ambassador to the United Nations in New York, who was a participant in the first discussion in the UN Security Council in December of 2014, talking about North Korea's human rights record and how it was a threat to peace and security, and the issue was therefore taken up by the Security Council. Peter Yo of the UN Foundation has a chapter in the book and made an excellent presentation on issues of the participation in the UN Human Rights Council, Special Rapporteur, the UN General Assembly, and the role that the United Nations can play in terms of encouraging North Korea to move in a more positive direction. One of the issues that we also spent some time talking about in the conference and in the book were issues of information and the important role of information in dealing with issues related to North Korea human rights and also issues related to North Korean security and security policy. Nat Kretchen, who's here today, is going to wrote one of the chapters that discuss this issue, and he'll talk about some of these issues in his presentation. Martin Williams was a participant and also wrote a good chapter that talks about these issues. And we had Min Jung Kim participate in the conference, and she talked about the role of South Korean non-government organizations and the importance that they play in this process. So all of these issues with regard to information are particularly important. Victor's chapter, which is one of the excellent chapters, talks about this issue of how do you balance security on one hand and human rights on the other, and how you can turn it into a non-zero sum process of dealing with that. So my sense is the book, which is based on the chapters, the presentations that were made during our conference, does an excellent job of covering the range of issues that we need to deal with in terms of looking at North Korea human rights, but also looks at it in the context that this is not a contest between security and human rights, and that one has to give if the other is to make progress. And I think that's the important part of the message that we wanted to make in terms of this presentation. A couple of other presentations that are included in the book. Sean King talks about the comparison of North Korea and East Germany and what has happened in East Germany and how that relates to what might happen or could happen in North Korea. And the final chapter is an excellent piece by Thomas Fingar, who was a U.S. government intelligence and analysis specialist at highest levels of the U.S. government for a long period of time before he went to his reward and was able to go to Stanford, where he is now involved in projects there. But Tom's comments are particularly useful in terms of looking at the issue that we're trying to get our hands around. But thanks very much for having this conference. Thanks very much for the contributions that all of you have made to it. And I look forward to your comments and the discussion.
Okay, thanks, Bob, for excellent overview of the book. I think the book has, 11 chapters, and once again covering many different issues. And we are expecting to have, hard copy right now today, but it's a little delayed, just like other supply chain problems. But we should have in print, very soon. So hopefully you can buy a copy when it's available. So now let me turn to Nat Kretchen, who also wrote a excellent chapter for the book. So Nat.
Thanks so much. Thanks to Stanford, to CSIS, to Dr. Shin, Dr. Cha, Ambassador King. Fabulous to be with you all. I will be very brief in the hopes of reserving a bit more time for questions and encouraging folks to give the book a read when these supply chain problems are resolved. I think access to information and freedom of expression hold a somewhat distinctive space conceptually in our discussions of human rights generally and in North Korea in particular, which I think jives well with the framing of the conundrum, as it were, in this book. Access to information, freedom of speech is, of course, per Article 19 of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, a human right in and of itself that should be protected. Access to information is also a necessary component for discourse around other fundamental human rights, such that censorship and surveillance can mediate or inhibit pursuit of other vital human rights as well. Also, I think kind of interestingly, due to the incorporeal, the kind of ephemeral nature of information and speech, it's a right that is unique in the modern age, at least, in its ability to be directly affected across borders, even without a governing regime's consent. For example, an outside actor has a far greater ability to improve access to information for an otherwise deprived people by sending in information than would be possible for, say, an outside actor trying to contend with domestic restrictions on Article 13's right to movement, for instance. In this space, geographic borders are not as completely limiting as they might be for other issues, and the issue can both be dealt with conceptually, but also in a quite practical way. So the chapters in this book that address access to information reflect that complex practical interrelation of information seekers in North Korea, those outside the country attempting to facilitate their access, and the North Korean state's quickly modernizing attempts to control its citizens' access to really a variety of forms of information. And from my perspective, this could not be a more timely discussion, as I really think we're in the midst of a pretty fundamental shift in North Korean authorities' approach to information controls, which I think in turn portends a pretty significant change in the information environment more broadly, and will thus demand some new approaches from those who are advocating for greater information access in North Korea. In the smallest of nutshells, I think North Korean authorities are constructing a pretty globally unique marriage of sophisticated digital censorship and surveillance capabilities and their more traditional isolationist leanings. They're learning lessons from more advanced digital authoritarians about how to conduct technologically enabled censorship and surveillance at scale, while simultaneously making practically none of the concessions to global interconnectivity and international commerce that most other modern digital authoritarian regimes must kind of balance. And yet this approach, it's still built on the back of modern ICT devices such as phones and tablets, which also introduce into the North Korean context new speeds and a geographic dispersion of communications that has just really never been experienced by ordinary citizens prior to the very recent past. So I think all that in practice means that North Korean citizens attempting to access or share information find themselves between generations of technology and governance. Legacy broadcast technologies, which are limited in the functionality and availability, but hard for authorities to block and control. And then on the other hand, modern network technologies that open up new avenues for connection and communication, while ushering in what's really a new age of censorship and surveillance, even in the North Korean context. Further, I think while North Korean people have far more agency than is often reflected in coverage of these issues in kind of popular media, and they really do display amazing ingenuity in achieving some measure of access to information despite the challenges, their ability to do so is pretty substantially influenced by outside actors attempting to provide unsanctioned information, and also by authorities' attempts to limit such access. So in the book we're discussing today, Min Jung Kim's chapter on NGOs' efforts to provide outside information to North Korean citizens really helpfully chronicles the evolution of such efforts over the last couple of decades, and I think serves as a really important reminder of the diversity of these efforts, embodied in their kind of different theories of change, as well as the informational content and technical means of information delivery that they pursue. It's really, we've seen a variety of approaches pursued across the years, and I think we often fail to reflect that diversity when we think about information access efforts into North Korea narrowly. Her section on essentially the extremely challenging operating environment for many NGOs under the current South Korean administration, I think, is worth some attention as well, as it highlights an important reality. While, as I mentioned earlier, broadcast technologies and digital media allow information freedom advocates to address important informational gaps without having to fully contend with domestic information restrictions in North Korea, complications in the operating environment in key third countries are really vital for the success of such efforts. So we have to pay attention to all of the kind of regional players to understand that full ecosystem. And then on the other side of the coin, Martin Williams' chapter is a compellingly holistic look at many of the levers of control North Korean authorities have to limit not only the act of access or sharing of unsanctioned materials, but for guarding against, I think, any potential activation of what might be used through, learned through foreign media, rather. He groups these levers into three broad categories: legal, ideological, and technical responses to the influx of outside media. And in doing so, he reminds us that even as the state has adopted new tactics of control, it remains really adept at wielding many of its more traditional means. Just because they've written a few new tunes, they have not retired the greatest hits, as it were. And his wide-angled approach, I think, is particularly relevant in light of what we've seen as these really prolonged COVID border closures. So where does that leave us? Creatively thinking about new ways to use old technologies to help with freedom of expression in North Korea, catalyzing what we see as kind of a natural sociological evolution with the presence of these new digital tools, trying to figure out ways to undermine the most coercive forms of control on North Korean networks, creating new channels of information dissemination in. These, I think, are all up for debate. And I think while none of these chapters offers easy answers to the challenges of information access in North Korea, they do chronicle the state of play in a way that facilitates the search for these new approaches, that also recognizes the dynamic situation on the ground inside of the country. And so I'll leave it there. Thanks a lot.
Okay, thanks, Ned. You raised a lot of important, interesting questions, so we'll come back to some of them. So now let me turn to Victor about your chapter and some other issues that you want to comment on.
Sure, thank you. So first, let me also thank Professor Shen and Ambassador King for leading this project. I thought it was a great project, very policy focused, but also academically strong. And as Professor Shen said, the volume that's about to come out any minute now was based on a conference that we had done earlier, and I was able to gather some of my thoughts on this while I was a Correct Fellow at Stanford in the winter quarter of 2019-2020. So I'm quite grateful for that opportunity, and I'm glad that CSIS and Stanford APARC Korea program could partner on today's event. So I think I really do think that this volume is quite important, and its timing is quite important because North Korea policy never goes away. It just continues to recreate itself with every new administration, and you have an administration in the United States and the Biden administration that's struggling with its own conception of how it should think about the North Korea issue. And I think this volume is important because it really does try to break the conventional policy wisdom that has prevailed on both sides of the Pacific with regard to two issues that matter very dearly for U.S. National interest. That is, freedom and liberty, and the respect for the integrity of every individual inherent in their right to be, a freestanding human being, as well as national security issues in terms of one of the most proximate and prominent security threats today to the United States. And as Ambassador King stated, for the longest time, we have not been able to carry those two ideas in our heads at the same time when dealing with North Korea. It has, as Ambassador King said if we pursue the security angle, it's at the expense of human rights, or if we pursue the human rights angle, it's at the expense of security. Another way of putting that in terms of policy is that when we're in negotiations over North Korea's nuclear program, we tend to not want to talk about the human rights issue because it becomes awkward, or it's seen as something that could pose an obstacle or slow down the ongoing nuclear negotiations. And it's only when we're not talking to North Korea that we feel more at liberty to speak about the human rights issues. This is nowhere is this point more clear than in Ambassador King's chapter, where he actually cites in the 2017 State of the Union speech how many references that President Trump made to North Korean human rights, which were numerous, at a time when we were not engaged in negotiations, security negotiations with them. But as soon as we became engaged in security negotiations with them, with the Singapore summit and the love letters that went back and forth between Trump and Kim Jong-un, we later learned, there's virtually no mention of human rights in the 2018 State of the Union speech. So you could not find a more stark and obvious contrast that really, it was a real world proximate example of this zero-sum trade-off, the conventional wisdom. And so my chapter, what I did was to try to take that as the entry point to a discussion that really questioned whether we should continue to abide by that conventional wisdom by asking the question, well, we have followed this path of pursuing security at the expense of human rights, or vice versa, and the best test of whether that particular model has worked is to ask, well, what are the results, right? And the results have, as we all know, have not been very positive. We have not talked about human rights in our discussions with North Korea, but I would argue it has not made. We have not had considerable advances in our denuclearization negotiations with North Korea by ignoring human rights. One could argue that it might not have gone. It would have gone even less farther than it did if we had included human rights. But either way, it's a suboptimal outcome. Whether it was, the counterfactual that we would have been worse off, or where we are today, the difference is between being worse off and really worse off. We're still worse off. So it's not really working. And so what we talked about in the conference and in the volume, and what I tried to do in my chapter, was to say, practically speaking, how should we think about connecting the human rights agenda and the denuclearization agenda? And in my chapter, I said there are essentially four ways we should think about this. The first is that it's the right thing to do. Right, the United States as a country, South Korea as a liberal democracy, should raise human rights if in discussions with North Korea, because it's the right thing to do. Because there is, as the COI report documents, and as everyone here knows, there are horrible human rights abuses in North Korea, and it is incumbent upon the United States and countries like South Korea, leading democracies in the world, to say something about human rights. So one, it's the right thing to do. Second, if one of the goals of our strategy with North Korea is eventually to get to a point where we recognize each other formally as nation states, US DPRK normalization, it's inconceivable to me that that outcome could be pursued, let alone achieved, without having some sort of human rights dialogue with North Korea. Yes, the United States in the past has worked with, less than stellar regimes, but in terms of the objectives and the ambitions of North Korea's strategy, as they have been laid out by successive administrations going back to 1994, normalization has been one of the endpoints of this. And so it's impossible really to think about normalizing relations with North Korea without there being some addressing of the human rights issues. Third, combining the human rights and denuclearization agenda is politically smart. We're living in a day, both in South Korea and the United States, of great political polarization. But there are very few issues that gain bipartisan support in the U.S. Congress. But this is one of them, right? North Korean human rights. This is one of them. When Bob King was the envoy, he had unqualified bipartisan support for his mission. The North Korean Human Rights Act has passed and been renewed in Congress with overwhelming bipartisan support. It is the politically smart thing to do. And if any U.S. administration were to negotiate denuclearization and normalization with North Korea without addressing the human rights issue, you can be certain that they would face a lot of questions in Congress about why the human rights issue wasn't addressed. So third, it's a politically smart thing to do. And then fourth, the core, I would argue that the core transaction in the U.S. agreements with North Korea, the past U.S. agreements with North Korea on their nuclear program, is a basic quid pro quo where North Korea would disarm in return for entree to the international community, and in particular the lifting of sanctions and economic rejuvenation of the country, plugging them into the most economically dynamic and prosperous region of the world today, which they are not connected to. In Trump's language, he talked about this as casinos in Wonsan, which is, it's a pretty simplistic interpretation, but it gets at the heart of what is on offer to North Korea, and that is connecting with the international community in return for giving up these weapons of mass destruction. Well, it may not seem like it, but human rights is a very important part of that, because even if the President of the United States were to say so, existing U.S. law and UN Security Council sanctions makes it very difficult for private sector to engage with North Korea as long as there are these human rights abuses inside the country. So ironically, the United States or South Korea or others raising the human rights issue is actually credible signaling, right? To use international relations, it's credible signaling because it means that we are really committed to providing the economic support to North Korea because we want some of these human rights issues addressed, such that we can legally do that, or such that the private sector can legally bring capital, bring enterprise to North Korea. So these things are not at all disconnected. They're actually, human rights is actually integral to the U.S. strategy on North Korea. And so, again, I think that that's why this volume is particularly important at this time. In my chapter, I also talk about the distinction between humanitarian assistance and human rights. This is a particularly relevant question today, given the COVID situation. Well, the border shut down because of the COVID situation in North Korea, which has created a very dire economic situation inside the country, and has raised a lot of questions about whether humanitarian assistance should be on the table for discussion with North Korea. And then finally, the last thing I'll say is that aside from the humanitarian assistance side, on the human rights side, the most important and positive force for improvement of the human condition in North Korea has been the growth of markets. And I talk a little bit about this at the end of my chapter. It is the one thing that has really improved the lives of North Koreans, improved the human condition in North Korea, and more importantly, as Nate suggested, has been the funnel through which they have been able to gain access to information and given them hope in terms of having the ability on their own to improve their own lives. And that's probably the most important human right that we can give to the North Korean people. So with that, again, I want to congratulate Professor Shin and Ambassador King on this great volume. I hope all of our viewers get a chance to read the book, because I think it's really very important work. Back to you.
Okay, thanks, Victor, for a great presentation. So before I start our conversation, once again, send your question on event page, and then we'll try to address as much as possible. And also, as some of you may know, Bob King wrote a book by himself, Patterns of Impunity, Human Rights in North Korea, and the role of the special envoy, U.S. special envoy. So he began writing this book when he was fellow at our center. It's a great book. So it's kind of companion. So with his book and then this volume. So please read both of them. Okay, let me start with some maybe question about your experience in the government for Bob and Victor. And here we are trying to, raise question about how to balance, between human rights and nuclear security in dealing with North Korea. And, Bob, you more dealt with or focused on human rights issue. And Victor, I guess you're more on security in dealing with North Korea. And I don't think you overlap, but still, in the government, among agency, I mean, do you really talk to each other? Or so I just like to get a sense of what's it like in the government. Now, working anymore at this point, so you can be more honest. But then I'm sure some may say, oh, human rights is important, but then let's set aside for a while. Let's focus on nuclear issues. So, what's it like discussion among agencies in the government? So maybe real-time kind of picture of kind of conversations or debate.
You want to start, Victor, or do you want me to start?
Please, you go ahead.
This was a real concern, I think, with the people who were involved in appointing me. It was required by law. The House and Senate had adopted legislation. There was to be a special envoy with rank of ambassador, specific instructions as to what was to be done. And so I think there was some concern about this with the Obama administration when Hillary Clinton came in as Secretary of State. One thing that put additional pressure on on Clinton was that ambassadorships were being held up by then Senator Sam Brownback until he got assurance that a special envoy for North Korea human rights issues would be appointed. And the Assistant Secretary of State was held up by Brownback until Clinton gave him assurances that there would be somebody in place. So there was the congressional factor was an important element here in terms of encouraging that. The other thing was there was a real commitment on the part of Secretary Clinton on other officials in the State Department that human rights would need to be a part of our policy towards North Korea, and we needed to do this. So it was there was a sense that it was a good idea. The thing that was probably of concern is to have a human rights envoy who wasn't plugged in. And being a full-time member of the staff, being in Washington, I was put in with the group of people who are dealing with the nuclear issues, as well as the day-to-day issues of North Korea and South Korea, so that we were dealing with all of these issues with the same group of people. I spent more time in the State Department dealing with the Human Rights Bureau and with people concerned about information and that kind of thing. But nonetheless, my office was right next door to Steve Bosworth and Glenn Davies, who were negotiating or trying to negotiate with the North Koreans on the nuclear issue. We kept each other informed. We talked about it. We worked together. Bosworth made a point of making sure that I was invited to meetings that took place. when the North Koreans sent the deputy foreign minister to the United States and had conversations here. I was part of the lunch where we discussed some of these issues. We had a good conversation, and it was a very useful conversation. So I think there was an effort to structure it in a way that it was helpful. And I think that's an important part of the process. I think with the Trump administration, there was no interest in doing this, and there was more concern than anything. And the result was no official was ever appointed as special envoy for North Korea human rights issues. But I think that it does need to be part of an integrated process, and it works much better if it is.
Victor?
So I would certainly agree with that. So I worked with Bob King's predecessor, who was the first appointed senior special envoy for human rights, Jay Lefkowitz, who took on the position and was doing it from New York because he lived in New York and was coming to Washington as needed. But I would say that there was a disconnect because Ambassador Lefkowitz was trying to push forward on the human rights issues, and we were deeply involved in the six-party negotiations, and there was just people just didn't think there was room to talk about human rights. Maybe in the context of one of the 5 working groups of the six-party agreement, which was USD-PRK bilateral relations, bilateral normalization. Theoretically, it could be talked about there, but it really wasn't. It was very much a part of this conventional wisdom, and I was a part of it. Where we said like we can't talk about this now because the relationship is really bad. Now, having said that, we had a president, right, President George W. Bush, who was very passionately concerned about human rights, and so he on his own, using the Oval Office, waged his own human rights campaign that included signing into law the first North Korean defector resettlement program in the United States, for the first time bringing North Korean defectors into the Oval Office for meetings and conversations. And so we had this very interesting combination where we had the envoy, who was, not a part of the nuclear negotiations, but who was very much in sync with the president, like the top boss, who had very strong views on not just in North Korea, but human rights more broadly. The thing I remember the most, however, was I think when Ambassador King went to the region to talk to allies and partners about human rights, he was able to do that pretty effectively. But at the time, our envoy at the time, Mr. Lefkowitz, had a very difficult time when he went to the region, and even when he went to South Korea, because the South Korean government, also very focused on engagement with North Korea, didn't want to talk about the human rights issues. This was the Nomuhyun government. Didn't really want to talk about, found it very awkward to talk about the human rights issues. And I remember there were occasions where we implored the government that they must take meetings with our envoy because it was important for them to do so. So it was. I do remember that when Ambassador King was there, I remember the suite of offices that I think the 4 of you had. It was you, and then the special envoy for North Korea, the envoy for nuclear, for six-party talks, and then the envoy for sanctions. I think there were 4 of you in that office, and so that in governments, office space and where you sit, and it means a lot. And the fact that they had the 4 of them together was a sign that they were making an effort at policy integration.
Okay, thank you. So I'll come back to this issue a little later, but let me turn to Ned for your insights. As you know, there was a controversy when South Korean government banned sending leaflets into the north. And I think there are two questions. One was sending leaflets really effective in sending information to North Korea? I mean, you mentioned the importance of inflow information to North Korea. So was it really effective? And number two, South Korean government said that, I mean, there's a complaint from Pyongyang, right? And then in order to improve relations with North Korea, I mean, they had to listen to them and they banned. So was it really effective also in containing information inflow into North Korea? So I think in a sense, were both really effective or both were more political gestures? So what's your assessment?
You definitely have thrown me the sticky wicket of information questions, Dr. Shin. I would say in general, it's probably best to piece apart some of the sub issues there. On the one hand, like we have conducted surveys for many years of North Korea. It's hard to find evidence of broad impact of balloon campaigns. There are certainly anecdotal evidence of localized impact, but when you compare it to some other forms of information dissemination into North Korea, it is probably less broadly effective. If you compare it to broadcast and other kind of more broad-based approaches. That said, I think an interesting dynamic that unveils is one that we saw, say, around South Korean military loudspeaker broadcasts, is that there is an element of kind of public display that sometimes gets conflated with the efficacy of an approach to information dissemination, which can kind of cut both ways. On the one hand, loudspeakers on the border, probably less broadly impactful than ongoing radio broadcasts that can reach the entire population, or hyper compelling South Korean dramas coming in through other means. And yet that was a really important symbolic thing as a kind of back and forth between the two governments that they were negotiating over. So I think the thing that we were worried about with the South Korean government in the legislation around balloons, at least from my perspective, was less the balloon issue specifically and more the willingness to crack down on essentially these kind of efforts and show that this is an open society in which civil society should have the ability to, within limits, conduct this kind of advocacy. So I think that was, whether there needed to be kind of specific limitations put around specific activities or not, the seeming reluctance to show a vibrant civil society that was reflecting a wish to send information in, I think was the most concerning part of that episode, at least from my perspective.
Okay, thank you. I think there are some questions from the audience about the impact of COVID-19 on North Korea. I think this question to any of the panelists. So do you have any good sense of the current situation in North Korea? I mean, now we are entering almost 2 full years since pandemic began, and many of people in the world they're suffering, and it's not hard to imagine that there are a lot of North Koreans are suffering, right? So I think there are two questions. One is, do you know any good assessment of the current situation in North Korea? And number two, is there anything we can do, either U.S. government or South Korean government or NGO to address? I think some questions saying, should we increase our humanitarian support or assistance to North Korea? Or I think one person saying, or should we press North Korea to deal with violation of human rights in North Korea? So I invite any panelists to make any comments on those issues.
Maybe I can. Oh, go ahead, Victor. Go ahead.
No, you go first.
The COVID-19 is a very interesting case study of how North Korea deals with issues. First of all, they've denied it. They deny that there are any North Koreans that have been afflicted by COVID-19. They've shut the borders. They've stopped virtually most trade going in and out of North Korea. There are stories coming out of North Korea of Russian diplomats wanting to return to Russia and having to push their own luggage on rail carts across the bridge over the Tumen River to get to Russia because of fear of the COVID. The North Korean government continues to deny that there are any COVID cases in the country. They have reported this officially to the UN. It's hard to believe that that's the case. On the other hand, North Korea does manage to keep itself so tightly isolated, and that has increased in this era to make it very, it is possible that that things are kept under control simply because people are forced to stop having contact. I think it's more an indication of the ability of the North Korean regime to force its population into, lack of contact. But what this means in the long run is hard to tell. I think there is definitely a role for the United States and for other countries to play in terms of dealing with North Korea on humanitarian issues like COVID-19 and other such things. It would be useful and helpful to provide medicines and vaccines and other kinds of technical help to North Korea, and we ought to be doing some of that. This ought to be something done through, individual governments when they've got large programs or can mount large programs, as the U.S., South Korea can do, but through UN agencies when there are other countries that can and should be involved. And I think when we're talking about this humanitarian assistance, it's something that really goes beyond the politics. The difficulty is that when you're providing humanitarian assistance, you want to make sure that the decision is based on humanitarian needs, not on seeing that those who are in highest leadership levels are the ones who get the benefits. And for the United States, we can provide assistance, but by law, we are required to assure that the distribution of assistance we provide is monitored, so that those who are most in need are the ones that receive it, which means it doesn't go just to the members of the Central Committee first and then down the pecking order. So there are issues that are complicated, but nonetheless, it's the kind of thing that we ought to be engaged in. There are a number of American NGOs that do really good humanitarian work in North Korea. We need to provide help and assistance to them and do what we can. Right now, it's difficult to get into North Korea, and I'm not sure there's a lot that can be done, but there should be some effort made to try to reach out in some of these areas.
Okay, Victor on net.
Yeah, so I would add a couple of points. First, yes, this border has been closed since January of 2020, so we are rapidly approaching 2 years of North Korea having really no contact with the outside world, and no contact with, or virtually no contact with, its most important trading partner in the world, and that is China. So, irregardless of whether there is transmission in the country or not, the steps they've taken to try to prevent and minimize the risk to COVID have had devastating economic consequences for the country, and it's been actually much more resilient than I expected it could be. But I think now we're starting to hear more and more about price increases, about shortages of basic materials, about energy shortages, food shortages. The situation does appear to be quite acute. We're actually working on a report right now, a satellite imagery report that are looking at some of the efforts that North Korea is undertaking to try to reopen the border, which include the building of effectively cargo quarantine facilities on the border in order to try to, bring in cargo and quarantine it and try to, in that way, open to trade. There have been unexplained delays in terms of this. They started this at about the 1-year mark of when the border's been closed, but there's some unexplained delays. But still, that is not going to completely alleviate their problem. It's going to far from alleviate their problem, and this will continue to be a major issue. In terms of international support and vaccine, North Korea applied successfully to COVAX to be on the list to receive the vaccines. There was a delay over the summer just because of the global supply shortage of vaccines. But the amazing thing now is that, according to reports, they have rejected, at least on 3 different instances, the provision of a Chinese vaccine, the provision of the Russian vaccine, and the provision of AstraZeneca. And nobody knows exactly why that's the case. I have my own theories or explanations for that, but that also is puzzling. That a country that has really put itself in a very difficult position because of deathly fears that the virus raging through the country, they don't have a health system or the capability to deal with it, and yet they are rejecting these offers of vaccines from the international community. So as Bob said, there is a humanitarian need here, and whether it's the international community, the United States, or South Korea or others, it's important that humanitarian assistance sort of meet the norms and standards for how humanitarian assistance is executed in countries like this. And that, if somebody gives them vaccines, they're supposed to vaccinate the most vulnerable, not the most privileged first. And we can never be sure of that with North Korea. So it is a case for humanitarian assistance, but it has to be done the right way.
Yeah, one small addition to that is simply kind of to note an interesting, I think, catalyzation because of the border closure of a trend that we have already seen. In terms of information flow in North Korea, the Chinese border has always essentially been the core door to all sorts of information and trade. In the wake of the arduous march, that was really done at a low level with individuals kind of crossing at their own volition. Since then, I think there's been a pretty steady and ongoing retrenchment to more constricted channels of movement back and forth, which is something that I think the North Korean authorities have made pretty concerted efforts to securitize the border and to limit those flows to essentially pre-approved channels. I would expect that, despite the fact that they certainly want to open some channels up for kind of the economic need, they will be doing so in a way that is very security conscious, and it tries to not essentially give up some of the control gains that they have received by shutting down the border as completely as they have in the COVID period.
Okay, so there are so many questions from the audience, but let me come back to this human rights and nuclear security issues. And I think question saying you guys made very compelling points as to why both human rights and nuclear security must be discussed together. But then what are really practical steps or ways to achieve that objective? Because I think dealing with a nuclear security issue alone is very challenging. I mean, we have seen over the last 3 decades. And also North Korea will take raising human rights issue as a way of undermining the regime. So what are practical steps to achieve that? And more specifically, this is from my colleague, Sig Hacker. How does one divide the public versus private push for human rights issues during the nuclear negotiations? So these are tough questions, but I still like to get your insight.
So let me try. First, I would say that there's no denying that it's hard. Right? When you've been doing things one way for a long time, arguably for decades, it's hard to switch, right? And so it would be difficult. It's difficult for the foreign policy establishment to say, okay, now we're going to include North Korea as another issue in the agenda. From a negotiator's perspective, it would essentially be saying, okay, my job is hard enough as it is, and now you want to make it even harder by allowing the North Koreans to say, now you're not just putting up one goalpost, you're putting up two goalposts, and you're moving them at the same time, right? As we're doing the negotiation. But I think one of the responses there is, again, I think as people have written in the past, especially with distrustful negotiation counterparts like the U.S. and North Korea, it's all about credible signaling, right? Mm-hmm. So if the North Koreans were to take steps on human rights, and this could be done in a private conversation, as one of the questions mentioned, as opposed to a public shaming conversation. But if they were to take steps on human rights, that would be something different that we have not seen before, and even among skeptics would raise eyebrows as to saying, well, this looks a little bit different. Frankly, if the Biden administration got into another negotiation where we traded heavy fuel oil for a freeze of operations at the Yongbyon nuclear reactor, like, how many people would believe that that's credible, right? Because it's been broken several times already. Like, nobody's going to believe that that's credible. But if we see something different, like a dialogue on human rights, like a serious dialogue on what human rights steps would lead to lifting of some of UN sanctions or US law related to human rights, right? I mean, that would be a different and much more credible and potentially fruitful area of negotiation that could have positive spillover effects for credibility in the nuclear negotiation. It's not easy. No way is it easy. It would require authorization at the top because starting to remove some of these sanctions, even on human rights, may require executive orders for something like that to happen. But I think our point is that what we're doing thus far hasn't really worked, and this is an issue that matters or should matter for U.S. policymakers and for the American people, and for South Korean policymakers and the South Korean people. And so we're just saying you need to look at this and consider it. Still, the government in South Korea and the Biden administration today do not have human rights envoys for North Korea. I mean, there has been no successor to Ambassador King now for well over 5 years, over 2 administrations. So,
Bob or Ned?
Can I add a couple of comments? First of all, on this, how do you integrate? How do you push human rights at the same time you're trying to make progress on security issues? It seems to me that there are a couple of things that you can do on the human rights side. One is to focus on some of the human rights issues that are less sensitive. One of the things that the North Koreans have actually made progress on is in the area of human rights for people with disabilities. And there are things that we could do in terms of encouraging that and recognizing that would help build a better relationship to go on to other issues. And I think that's something that's worth doing and worth trying to deal with. Humanitarian aid is an area where I think there's room for progress. There are things that we can do and should do. One of the things that was particularly disappointing was the decision that was made in 2017 to exclude all travel to North Korea by American citizens, with the exception of journalists who were going in a specific journalistic capacity. That, I think, was particularly harmful because there are a number of American NGOs, private groups that have been involved and engaged with North Korea, and they've made real progress in terms of opening up channels of information, so that if there were some effort to adjust sanctions to take this into account, I think that would be a helpful step, a helpful progress. On the other hand, one has to keep in mind the North Koreans are very difficult to deal with. It's not like if you offer them aid, they're going to say, yes, thank you, we'd love to have you here, as evidenced by the fact that they've turned down vaccines that have been offered them. It's not going to be an easy project, and certainly negotiating on nuclear issues has not been an easy project. Dealing with the North Koreans on the human rights issues is not going to be an easy one. Sig Hegert mentioned this question of public and private efforts. It seems to me that one of the things the U.S. government ought to do is encourage private efforts, encourage NGOs that are engaged in medical and educational and other kinds of projects in North Korea. We ought to do everything we can to encourage it. I think there's less interest in encouraging American runners who want to go so they can say they've run in the Pyongyang marathon. But there are things like that that we can do that would move us in the right direction. I think we should do it, and I think there's value in doing it. And I agree, Victor's comments were particularly good in terms of some of the areas where we can cooperate. Thanks.
So Ned, any comments to add?
Not much to add other than to say, in kind of my own more narrow corner of the issue, I would definitely co-sign essentially what was implicit in both Victor and Bob's comments in terms of like allowing for more bottom-up participation. I think we benefit strategically in negotiations when we present a more complex hand rather than trying to control everything as tightly and as narrowly, with all the caveats to the inherent difficulty duly noted.
Yeah. So Bob, we still appreciate your strong support for our engagement with North Korea in education, medical support, and so on. So hopefully, people can continue. So now let me ask, final question, combining a lot of questions from the audience. It's more like moving forward. Victor, you mentioned that there's no special envoy appointment. And actually, we don't have American ambassador in Seoul either, actually. I mean, it's been a while. And then someone saying that like Sung Kim, is a great person for the job, but he might be part-time, right? He is still in Jakarta, right? So I think some people are saying that does Biden administration really has any interest in dealing with North Korea? Okay, so it's not really my view, but I think that's a view by many people, including in the audience. And then also working with Seoul is very important. But now South Korea is getting into election, and there will be election in early March next year, and we don't know who's going to win. Either progressive keep their power, or conservative, may come back to power. So in a sense, next 6 months will be quite important in managing. So what we need to do, let's say, at least for next 6 months, until probably we have all those appointments, key appointments, and also possibly new government in Seoul. So any ideas, any suggestions moving forward next 6 months or so?
Let me try to answer those questions. So first, the appointment process, relatively speaking, the Biden administration is behind on appointments compared to previous administrations because of holds that have been placed on a lot of these appointments in the Senate by a couple of Republican senators. Having said that, there hasn't been an ambassador named to Seoul, and there hasn't been an envoy named for North Korean human rights. And I think everybody believes that those need to happen as soon as possible. In terms of the the road ahead. I think the Biden administration is not without expertise on this problem. Many of its officials in the White House and the State Department have been involved in previous negotiations at the very highest levels. And they are familiar with all of the roadblocks and the frustration and the difficulty, and some would argue the futility of trying to negotiate with North Korea. Thus far, until recently, the North Koreans have not really pushed their hand because they have not done the bevy of provocations that they usually greet every new U.S. president with. We haven't seen that, probably because of COVID. We haven't seen that, but we're starting to see more now, and the administration will be forced eventually, sooner or later, to deal with North Korea much more upfront than sort of as a back burner issue. I think it's very challenging for the ambassador to one of our biggest embassies and most important countries in Southeast Asia to carry this portfolio and a fully active negotiation with North Korea. I think he's a very competent and is the institutional memory of the negotiation in the U.S. government today, but he's only one person, and he has to sleep, right? And there are only 24 hours in a day, and so I think it's very hard. It's very hard to do that. So they need to find a solution to that. I think, as you know well, and as many of our listeners know well, the South Korean government, the Moon government, in its last few months in office, is not pressing on human rights issues with North Korea. It's pressing on an end of war declaration, pressing very hard on an end of war declaration. We can certainly discuss that. That is certainly not about human rights, and it's not about denuclearization. So it's about neither of the issues that we're talking about. The question is whether an end of war declaration could facilitate either of those two issues. It's not clear to me that it can. I mean, I'm happy to be convinced otherwise, but it's not clear to me at this particular point that that can open a discussion on denuclearization or open a discussion on human rights with North Korea. The last time the South Koreans had an envoy for human rights was during the conservative governments in South Korea. My guess is if that the conservatives won, they would also appoint an envoy for human rights and have it much more a part of their policy. But I don't expect to see anything different from the Moon government on this in its remaining time in office. And I would expect that one of the things to look for on the human rights side in a new government, whether it's progressive or conservative after the election in March, is whether there will be any reclaiming of the ground that has been lost by NGOs in their work on North Korean human rights. They have been, in many ways, they have been undercut, underfunded, rolled back by the current administration in Seoul, and these activities have garnered international attention, including from the United Nations. So I think that'll be one area to watch in terms of human rights, regardless of who comes to power after the election, whether some of that lost ground can be recouped.
Okay, and then what, Bob?
I'm surprised. I'm struck by how much Victor and I agree on everything. Republican administration. I work for a Democratic administration, but we're in the same place. The appointment of an ambassador to Seoul is one of the things that's really important. The problem is not the Biden administration. The problem is not Tony Blinken. The problem is Ted Cruz. Ted Cruz is sitting on 20 ambassadorships right now. He's refusing to allow them to go forward. I worked in the House of Representatives for 25 years, and so I don't want to say disparaging things about the Senate. But quite frankly, to allow one senator to do what Ted Cruz is doing shows gross incompetence on the part of some of the members of the Senate to allow that to happen. That's what's happened with the Seoul ambassadorship. That's what's happened with the special envoy for North Korea human rights issues. Tony Blinken has already indicated the administration would like to appoint someone to that position, and that they intend to do that. At this point, when you got whatever it is, 20 ambassadorships sitting there waiting for the Senate to act on them, they've had committee hearings, they have received approval, they're ready to go, but it takes the Senate to say yes. In most cases done without a formal vote, but one senator can step in and say, nope, you can't raise this issue. It's hard because that was one reason why I was appointed as quickly as I was, because Brownback said, I want somebody in that position. Not the way to do business and not the way to conduct our foreign policy. But domestic politics is always a messy situation. I think that the efforts are important in terms of what's going on with human rights. And I think it's important to have people in place that can move it forward. And I hope that we'll see that happen soon.
And that you have the final words.
Oh, final word. That's a tall order. Other than to say, being from the NGO side and not in government at all, I'd just further echo Bob and Victor's comments in terms of the outlook. I mean, certainly what is possible for private civil society actors is very much defined by folks in both administrations in the US and South Korea. I think from a kind of inflection point in the future of information access in North Korea, we need to be really undergirding the kind of things that take effect over a long time, but also really focusing on new innovations to respond to what are really a new form of information controls. And as Victor said, claw back a lot of the unfortunate losses we've seen in NGO support from South Korea. And that's not going to happen effectively until we have folks in place.
Okay, thank you. I think now we are over the time, and it's great to have Bob and Victor at our center and working on 2 books, and then Ned and other people made a contribution. So I think it's a great collaboration between Washington or DC and California. And I welcome more from Washington. Today it's like blue sky 70. So you guys are welcome to come to our center and our university. And we'll continue our collaboration. And for that, I really appreciate CSIS and Victor for co-sponsoring this event. So hopefully we can continue our collaboration in the coming years. Thank you so much and have a great day. And then see you again. Thank you.
Thank you.